The Torah commands us to listen to the Chachamim. And the Gemara uses that pasuk lo sasu as a source for Chanuka. And specifically the bracha that we recite on Chanuka. Hechan tzivanu, how do you recite the tzivanu? And the Gemara quotes lo sasu. I mean, this is a long discussion, a machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban as to how to interpret that Gemara. And the Rambam takes the Gemara at a simple, straightforward level that the Torah has authorized the Chachamim to create Chanuka, and we have to observe Chanuka because of Lo Sos. But the Gemara says that Chanuka is very unique because this mitzvah of Ner Chanuka lends itself to Hidur mitzvah in the most unique way. The Gemara says in the famous brisa of my Chanuka on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis in the Masechta Shabbos that the mitzvah of Ner Chanuka is Ner Ish Ubeisa, one candle per night, every night for the entire family. The Mahadrin, Ner L'chalecha V'echad, and Mahadrin bin Mahadrin. Here we have the famous machlokas between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beit Shammai will start with Holchin U'Pochsin, and Beis Hillel will say Holchin U'Mosifin. Before we get to the machlokas Beis Hillel, Beit Shammai, which is really our subject for today, let's just ask the following question. This question was raised by many. We're going to focus on the answer of the Beis Halevi, Rabbi Yoshe Ber Brisker, as to why Chanuka, in specifics, was singled out for such a unique element of Mahadrin and then Mahadrin min Mahadrin. Davar shalom matzinu b'shar hamitzvos. We have, for example, Zeh kelim ve'adveu, and the Gemara interprets it as referring to a sukkah na, a lulav na, and we should beautify every single mitzvah. And that's what we call Hidur mitzvah. Famous Chakira, whether Hidur mitzvah is part of the mitzvah itself or it's a mitzvah unto itself and sets itself up as independent of the mitzvah. But be that as it may, where do we find Mahadrin min Mahadrin? Says the Beis Halevi, who has many, many insights about Chanuka, that the Nes itself is tied together. The original miracle for which we commemorate by lighting the Ner Chanuka is for abundance. It's tied together with Hidur mitzvah. And why is that so? Hachat Shemen was found as the Chashmonaim looked for Shemen to be madlik the Menorah. They could have used, says the Beis Halevi, psilos dakos, which means that there's no real shear in how much shemen has to be consumed in order to fulfill the mitzvah of hadlakas ner shebemikdash. What's critical is that you light a ner that could last for the entire time period. But exactly how much shemen would it take to last for that time period? Let's say for 12 hours, maybe for 24 hours, depending upon how you understand the mitzvah of Hatavas HaNeros. But be that as it may, it's all a function of the ratio between the thickness of the wick and the volume of shemen. The thicker the wick, the more shemen gets absorbed, and therefore the larger volume of shemen do you need to last for that period of time. But if you use thin wicks, then the thinner the wick, the less it sucks up from the shemen, and the longer it will last. And shemen, which could have required for 8 days a volume of 8 times 1, could last for 8 days because of the thinness of the wicks. But the Chachmonoim made a decision. It's very fascinating on a halachic level to justify that decision, that they would use regular thick wicks. And that's because of Hidur mitzvah. A light that comes from a very thin wick is not as bright and is lacking in the glorious beauty of Ner Shebemikdash. And therefore, lo matzina lepsilos mikra din shir shel kamatiu avos. The halacha doesn't require a minimum thickness in the wick. V'yachlu lasos psilos sheyu oivyon shminis, 1/8 of the thickness. Mimasher gilim hayu lahadlik bamigdash. Could you imagine a wick that is so thin? It's 1/8 of the size of the wicks that we used on a daily basis in the mikdash. But we'll do this in order to get 8 full days of lighting. And that's probably what the halacha would advocate. But the Chashmonaim were more interested in the prominence of Hidur Mitzvah. They understood that no matter how many days the candles in the mikdash would last, the main thing is that they're beautiful candles and that the halacha was done by Hidur. And the Hidur takes precedence. And therefore they decided from the perspective of maximizing Hidur, they would use the thicker wicks. V'nasel and Nes, and there was a miracle, and the amount of shemen that would have been consumed on one day lasted for a full 8 days. So the miracle itself was really a result and was necessitated by the Hidur Mitzvah. If not for the Hidur Mitzvah, it wouldn't have needed to be a nes. As the Rambam says at the beginning of Hilchos Chanuka, it would take them 8 days to produce shemen tar from scratch. Aval mitoch shebnei Yisrael sheba'osa adar rotzu shetia shal heves dolekes behidur, a beautiful flame, which is a glorious Hidur Mitzvah, is therefore osuas apsilos avos kimidos tamid, as they always did, and as a result of the Hidur, even though al piderech hateva lo yaspik hashemen l'sheva yamin, it was only enough for 1 day, not for another 7, and yet Hashem did an es. Lefichach tiktu chazal b'mitzvah zu hidurim yoser mib'chol mitzvahs. The nes itself, for which we commemorate by lighting that Chanuka, was a result of Hidur Mitzvah. It's the Hidur Mitzvah that generated the nes, that brought about the nes. And therefore, the Hidur Mitzvah is essential to the nes. We will publicize this mitzvah with Hidur upon Hidur in order to demonstrate that the original miracle which we are commemorating is a result of Hidur and Mitzvah. Ikar hanes nasalahem b'shel Hidur. The Gemara tells us in Shabbos Tafchafal from Beis that Hachashemen was chasum bechosmo shel HaKohen Gadol, and that proved beyond the shadow of a doubt that it was shemen tahar. And this is based on many sugyas and shas that deal with chasima. That once there's a chosem, and certainly a chosem on top of a chosem, we can guarantee that nobody was able to break the chosem and then reconstruct it again. So this was the chosem of the Kohen Gadol, testifying to the fact that the shemen was shemen tahar. Of course, it would only last for 1 day in such a small shemen, pach shemen. But here we have an insight of the Shiltos. The Shiltos, as you know, was written at the time of the Gaonim by none other than Rav Achai Gaon. And the Nitziv Mibaloj was the one who made for us the Shiltos accessible by writing a great work, a very intricate and very broad scoped work of an analysis and an explanation of the Shiltos of Rav Achai Gaon. Listen to the language of the Shiltos. Lo haya bo lahadlik afilu Yom Echad. There's no doubt in anyone's mind when they hear that the Shiltos is trying to answer the question why we celebrate 8 days of Hanukkah, the old question, which has, according to the Mefarshim, over 101 answers. And his answer is that there wasn't enough Shemin to last one day. There was a miracle even on the first of the 8th day. Now, let's just think about this for a moment. The Chosem of the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol went to great lengths with a Tircha Gedola to take a Pach Shemen and add his Chosem to it, seal it. And how much Shemen is in that Pach? Not enough to last for one single day. You can't even be Makayim the Mitzvah once with that Pach Shemen, and he took his Chosem in order to guarantee that this would be taught.
So I'm sorry. So why did he have that pach? If it's not good for one day, what's the?
An excellent question, Joe. I thought of the same question myself. So we're really, I mean, I'm not as fast as you are, but all right. So we're on the same page. But I'll tell you something. There's another question that we should ask. You know, Jews like to answer a question with another question. We have in all of the Avodas HaMikdash, in all the dimensions of the Beis HaMikdash, with regard to all its mitzvahs, we have a memuna. Memuna means someone who is appointed as the overall supervisor to guarantee that everything is done in the Mikdash correctly. That memuna, my friends, is not the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol has too much on his proverbial plate to be the memuna. And the question that we want to ask now is, why Bichlal was the Kohen Gadol involved in putting his chosem on the Pach HaShemen? That should have been the responsibility of the memuna. And I'm sure, Joe, you would agree with me that that's a good question. So we have some good questions. By the way, I want to thank Bruce, Joe, and Bobby for opening their cameras. And if I said this 1,000,001 times, still it's coming out of your ears. You can't imagine how that helps me and energizes me to give a Zoom shot. I don't know if you've ever given a shir on Zoom. Oh, Ruvain has joined us. I appreciate David. I see it more than just, that background, that fancy background. Yudi might be there. I don't know if he's there or not. His name is certainly on the screen. I don't see Monty today, but it was pretty amazing that I saw him last time. And here we have a very interesting approach to this whole story about the chosem of the Kohen Gadol on the Pach HaShem. With regard to Shemen, as we'll soon see in the Chumash, and this will shed a light on Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, the Torah requires what's called Shemen Kosis. Very refined shemen. And this is the most expensive and most beautiful shemen. It's what's called the Me'ula Shebeshmona. Me'ula means highest level, highest class, a quality that puts it in a separate category, Shemen Kosis. Now, imagine you're gathering together into a pach, shemen, which is such a special kind of shemen that has undergone a great deal of a process that's very, very tiring and very energizing. It requires a great deal of energy. And in halacha, we usually talk about a minimum period of time of 7 days. Very rarely do we have less than 7 days. So now we have a very interesting situation here that makes our question even more severe. Taking shemen kasis, which is so valuable, so expensive, and putting it into a pach shemen that will last not for 7 days, but for 1 single day. The Gemara Menachos on Daf Pei Vav says something very surprising. This Pach HaShemen, about which the entire miracle and the Mitzvah of Ner Chanukah revolves, is not the Pach HaShemen that was prepared for the Menorah, but rather, Lo letzarech ha-menorah huchan, says the Gemara, ela limenachos. Okay, now we have to learn a little bit of Masechet Menachos. Shemen shebenachos, right? The mincha was mixed up with shemen, blula b'shemen, does not require kosses. The ein chovaso lohavio min ha-me'ula shebeshmonim. Rabbi said, do you hear this? There are 2 categories of shemen, and we equate them, but they're fundamentally different. One is shemen lima'ar kasis for the adlok of the menorah, and the other is shemen, which is bolul in the soles of the mincha. It doesn't require ma'ula shemen. Remember the word ma'ula that we used before. Ma'ula is a separate category and a description that classifies the shemen from menorah. But the shemen from the menachos is not ma'ula. It doesn't have to be ma'ula. And the Gemara derives this from a drasha in Pei Vav, Menachos Pei Vav, kasis lama'ar, velo kasis lemenachos. No requirement of kasis with regard to menachos. And this is a reflection, the Gemara says, of the general principle called Rachmana Chasa Al Mamonim Shal Yisrael. Because there were myriads of menachos that were brought on a daily basis, and the volume of shemen that was required was extensive. To require shemen kasis, which is so expensive, and it's a result of a great deal of care in terms of the olives and removing the grapes from the oil from the olives. Kasis lama'or, the Torah didn't require that with regard to the menachos. Shemen kasis, damav merubim. Torah, all right, the Gemara says, Rachmana chasa al mamonim shal Yisrael. Now, by the way, on the side, just a footnote, this principle of Torah chasa al mamonim shal applies to the menorah as well. The Gemara tells us in the Masechet Tainis that because of the poverty of the Jewish people during the second bias period, the menorah was not made of gold, it was made of wood. But now we're talking about shemen. And the Torah requires shemen kasis lama'ar for hadlakas ner shebemigdash. That is a given, unchangeable. But not in the case of shemen lemenachos. And therefore, im shemen shebepacha yemucha lemenachos lo yakosis, Now we have to ask a question. If kasis is a requirement, a critical requirement in their Shebemigdash, how could they use the pach, that small volume of shemen she'ena ma'ula, shemen that was singled and designated for menachos? How could they use it for the ner Shebemigdash? Hare eno kosher adlaka. You see where this is like the opposite of the Beis Halevi. The Beis Halevi is arguing that they could have gotten away with psilos dakos, and they didn't do so because of Hidur Mitzva. And now we're saying just the opposite. They used the Pach HaShemen for the oil in the Menorah, which was disqualified because it was a Pach HaShemen that was designated for the Menachos. And to go back into a time machine, we turn the clock back almost 5 centuries. And we go to the Avbezdin of Emden. Lama hayapach chosim b'chosmo shel kohen gadol, says the Chuvas Pnei Aryeh from Emden. Ani lo nisorarti miyomai levakesh tam v'sibo lezos. I never had to work very hard to crack this nut. Hayadavar pashut etzli, says the Pnei Aryeh. Shemaise shahoya kachoy. What is the man talking about? Maise shahoya kachoya. And we're asking a fundamental question here. How could they use a pach shemen that's possible for that lokas hamenorah? Maisa shoya kachoya. Again, if I'm in a very chutzpahdik mood, I would tell you that the Pnei Aryeh is accusing the Chashmonaim of something that is not proper. Maisa shoya kachoya. Just give me a minute, Joe. I'll be right with you. And this created apparently a stir amongst the Talmidei Chachamim in Germany at the time of the Pnei Aryeh. And someone got up in a call and he quoted Rabbi Avram Lifshitz, who was an Avbezdin in a nearby city to Emden, I think it was called Rotterdam. And he said, Shemen ze meikaro lemenachos hayumiyuad, v'lo lekol hamenachos, ela leminchas chavitin shel kohen gadol, shahayat makriv b'chol boker. On a daily basis, every morning, the kohen gadol had to bring his own personal mincha, which is called the minchas hachavitin. It was an Isaron Soles Ushlosha Lugim Shemen. Okay, that's a Sugi Menachos. Ves Eile Hayamevi Mi Besa. It wasn't from the public funds like all the other Karbanos. The Momen HaTzibur of the Lishkas HaTruma, but it had to come Mishalo from his own private Shemen. You really have to learn Masechta Menachos from this. And he says the following. Again, this is unbelievable. I mean, it changes our whole understanding of what went on over there at Ner Chanukah. He says, Afal Pisha Shemen Lemenachos, Kosher, Shishaloa Yakosis. There's no requirement of Kosis in Shemen for Menachos. HaKohen Gadol Haya Gadol B'Tzidkus V'Gadol B'Osher. Right? There are 4 different ways in which a Kohen Gadol is Lamala Meru Adam Mikola Am, and one of them is that he was wealthy. Mahadir Lohavi Shemen Mahudar Zach V'Kosis Limited Minchaso. Again, if Rabbi Avram Lifshitz was here in the room, putting COVID aside, I would hug him without a mask. This is amazing. If I am the Kohen Gadol and I have to bring the shemen with mincha from my own personal shemen, then I have a fantastic opportunity on a daily basis so that the minchas chavitim will come with shemen of the highest level, the ma'ula shemen. It'll be kosis. It'll cost me a penny, but who cares? I'm a rich guy anyway. I'm the Kohen Gadol, a rich man. And mitoch tzidkus v'chasidus, mahaderes ha-mitzvah, and the pach shemen, which was the highest quality shemen, had the chosim of the Kohen Gadol, and that's how he would hide it wherever he hid it, because he wanted to designate it for his personal shemen, for his korban minchas chavit. The nostu, they put the shemen into pachim yuchadim. That was a very limited shear because it was for the daily mitzvah of shemen, which we said before in the Gemara Menachos, is shlosha lugim shemen. B'shvil shelo yis'arei b'shmonim acherim, to make sure that this was the ma'ula shebeshemen for the mincha and not mix it with any other shemen for any other mincha, he put his chosem as the Kohen Gadol on the pach hashemen. Shenitzchu beis chashmonoi motzu hakohen pach echad mipachim shel Kohen Gadol sheichel minchaso ushmano hayakashel menorah ki hayakasis aval rak shlosha lugim shemen hayabo v'lo hispik kidei ha-menorah sharei kama shemen hayanichnas l'ner chatzi lug nimtza l'shivas neros tzarech shlosha lugim v'chatzi lug. Basic arithmetic. How much do you need per ner? Every single ner had to be a chatzi lug. Multiply that by 7, and you end up with 3 and a. Did I get that right? With half a lug times 7 is 3.5 lugim. But how many lugim shemen were in the pach? There was only a requirement of 3 for the menachos, for the minchas chavitim. Is memela, what happens is he's short by a chatzi lug, because shivas haneros start shlosha lugim v'chetzi lug, and he only had 3 lugim of shemen in the pach. Mishum kach, now we shed a whole new light on the shilkus of Rabbi Chai, who says there wasn't enough shemen for one day. I'm telling you, it brings me to tears. It's just so beautiful how, if you're allowed, the pieces of the puzzle fit into place and a whole fresh new perspective on what went on over there. Nasalem, they take it for Laila Harishon. And he says it would last for 7 days. And even on the first night, there was a miracle. And he says, Nismale hapach mifagash v'shlimo hashlimu shatavas haneros kol shivas haneros. Somehow, miraculously, they would pour the shemen into the ner, and they would get twice the amount of shemen. They were able to fill up another chatzi lug shemen so that all 7 neros would be kosher. Hishlimu Hatovas kol shivas haneros. And it's interesting. You get the impression, I'm not sure if I'm reading into it too much, that they broke the chosem, they poured the pach, and yet the pach itself regenerated more oil. I don't know. That the pach would automatically, supernaturally fill up. Now we understand why Hidur plays such a central mitzvah, such a central role in the mitzvah of Ner Chanuka, not because of the Beis HaLevi, and they used a very thin wick, or I should have said they could have used this thin wick, and they decided not to, which, by the way, I don't know exactly how to justify that decision of the Hashmonaim, but Maisa Shahaya Kain Haya. But rather, there was a Hidur mitzvah on the part of the Kohen Gadol, using Shemen Kosis for designating for his Minchas Chavitu when he didn't need so, and therefore he wanted to put the Chosem and lock it up, and therefore the whole mess came about through Hidur mitzvah. If not for the Hidur mitzvah, the Kohen Gadol Rabbosai, they would not have been able to light the menorah with this Pach HaShemen. Forget about Nes. There's no possibility of a Nes. A Nes can happen when you light the menorah, but here you couldn't light the menorah because Kosis is absolutely kuva. It is indispensable, critical for the Ner Sheben Migdash. But Keva Chakon Gadol, he there as a mitzvah. Vehechin leminchaso shemen mehudar. To kosher the menorah. Whole new perspective on Mahadrim and Mahadrim.
So according to this, there was a nace on the.
Sorry, I got very excited about this. I'm telling you, at my age, when you see a chiddush like this, you've been celebrating Chanuka for
Where are you reading from, by the way, Rabbi?
Oh, I think David was kind enough to send this out. In my edition, this is on page 62. David, can you help me out here? Which page numbers are we using? The old edition or the new edition? David?
The new one.
What?
The new one.
New one. So it should be on page 62. I have it here,
Yeah, there's a first one, first Mahadrim and Hadrim thing, so I didn't realize. Anyway.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do now. That's on page 47. That's where we're about to start now.
But anyway, according to this shot, the first night was also a nace.
Yeah, that's what Ram Lifshitz. The first night was a nest. And that's what I think the Shiltas of Rabbi Chai Goen has in mind when he says the first night was a nest, because there was only 3 lugins worth in that path, which we would never have known if not for Rav Lifshitz. And 3 lugim would not be enough to fulfill the mitzvah of Ner Menorah, which required 3.5 lugim. Natzi look for each of 7 neros, and now the old kasha, the Beis Yosef. Why are we celebrating 8 days when the miracle was only 7 days? As I told you before, there are over 100 answers to that question. If you accept the thesis of Rabbi Ram Lifshitz, who's the Av Bezdin of Rotterdam, which I think still. I don't know if there are any Jews alive in Rotterdam today. Maybe there is. Oh, probably Chabad. Now, in the light of his new perspective on what went on with this Pach Shemen, a Pach Shemen that, according to the Shiltos, could not have lasted for 1 day. So you're talking about Shemen Kosis Lamaor, and putting it into this little pot. with a chosem and a Kohen Gadol. Why? Meshuggah. The whole story of the Gemara makes no sense. So,
Just asking if it's okay to use the Kohen Gadol's oil to begin with. It does it not have to be the tzubur's property for lighting the menorah?
no, because there's a separate drasha, Mishalo, that since that mincha is his private mincha.
Right, the mincha is his mincha.
Means for the menorah.
I mean for the menorah.
Oh, you're asking for menorah? Well, I mean, you have to know Masechta Shkolim for that, but I would assume one of two things. Either there's no special din. In other words, I can be menadev shemen. Where'd you go, Joey? Oh, there you are.
Just give me a second. Yeah.
Jumping around here. I mean, either there's an adava, like for example in Eitzin, right? So the Gemara talks about the Nadav of Eitzin and the Yontif that you celebrated when it was your day to bring the Eitzin. Even though the Eitzin is certainly for the Mizbeach, it's for the Tzibur and the Shemen as well, but you could be Menadiv it. And with that Nadava, it becomes Momenat Tzibur. I mean, you have to know if you did it what's called Yafa, with a full heart.
Also, could they have done the thin silos with the and made it last longer? That still would be possible for them to have done, and they didn't do that.
You mean to make it thin, like the Beis Halevi has it?
Yeah. In other words, if you took the three, in other words, I guess once you have the miracle that it was only 3 lugin and it filled 3.5
Lugin's worth of adlaka.
And I guess.
You could circumvent the whole chiddush of the Beis Halevi, which again is, in my mind, is very problematic. Because what is more important than halacha? I'll give you an example. This is a famous question that was asked to Reb Chaim Brisker. You have 2 esrokim. One of them is mahudar, but it's a safek murkav. It might not be an esrog, maybe it's 11. The other is vadei kosher, but it's not mahudar at all. And certainly you would take the one that's vadei kosher and not play games with Hidur. Again, there's a lot more to that story than I'm telling you now. But if you just jump back for a moment to our case, in the Beis Halevi's frame of reference, the whole miracle came about because of Hidur mitzvah, but I don't understand the halachic logic, or shall I say the license, that would allow going for Hidur mitzvah when you're going to miss tomorrow's mitzvah. Instead, they should have used thin wicks, which the halacha, I think, would require. So that's my kachayim. Now we get to mahadrim min mahadrim. So the Gemara offers a machlokes with 2 explanations. Beit Shammai, and again, if you're following me in the text, it's on page 47. Beit Shammai say, hochsin v'hoch. So you light 8 on the first night. And Beit Hillel say, madlik v'holach. And by the way, maybe in 2 weeks' time, we would discuss the question of who is doing the mahadrin and mahadrin. Is it every single one of is it built upon mahadrin, or is it a separate mahadrin and mahadrin as an alternative to mahadrin? Very complicated sugi, by the way. I think we discussed it in the past, I'm not sure. Do you remember this? No, who should be makayim the hadlok of mahadrin and mahadrin? Is it every single person? And that's Ner Yishu Beso, that's Ner L'chol Echad B'Echad. Anyway. So again, everyone agrees, whether it's Beis Hillel or Beit Shammai, that the number of candles in Mahadrim and Mahadrim reflects the 8 days of the miracle of Ner Chanuka. The question is whether we should light it as the days pass by or as they will come in the future. So we start with 8. And that's called Poches V'Holech. That's Beit Shammai. And Beis Hillel hold Mosif V'Holech. So we start on the first day with one ner, increasing with each night. Now, let's go with the first explanation of the Gemara. One explanation is that Beis Shammai are of the opinion Yesh lahadlik keneged yomim hanichnos, which means keneged the future miracle. We need a miracle already on the first day of 8 days. So if we look at the miracle from the perspective of li'asid, of the end of the road, then we want to start on day 1 with 8. The miracle on the second day was less. All we needed was 7 days, etc., till we got to the 8th day. All we needed was 1. And Beis Hillel say, Keneged Yomim Han Yotzim. Let's reflect the days as they pass by, not anticipating the future and going in that direction, but rather as they pass by, day 1, day 2, day 3, and that's how many candles you want. But now we get to our main topic for today. The second explanation in the Gemara for Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai hold Poches V'Holech Keneged Parei Achad, and Beis Hillel hold Mosif V'Holech Mailim B'Kodesh V'Lo Morid. The Gemara then reports that there were 2 Zekanim, 2 elders in Sidon, up in the north. One of them followed Beit Shammai and started with 8 candles. The other Beis Hillel. One said Keneged Parei Achag, and the other said Mailim B'Kodesh. You get the impression that the second approach to the Machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai Mahaj was accepted. There are 2 kashas on this Gemara. One is the Marsha and the other is the Pineal. Correct the Marsha, I don't understand. The Gemara Menachos, he tells you on the bottom, it's on Tzadites, derives from Psukim the principle of Mailim B'Kodesh. Mailim B'Kodesh applies in many, many different cases. And it expresses itself in many different ways. Could it be that Beit Shammai denied the halacha of Mailim B'Kodesh V'Lo Moridin? Now we have kasha number 2, the Pnei Yoshua's kasha. What is the connection between Pirsum HaNes of Nes Chanuka, the Ner of Chanuka, and Parei Achad, Ribono Shalom? We're way past Sukkot. We're preparing that for Chanukah. Who remembers Sukkot, let alone Parei Achad? But what's the logical connection between Parei Achad and Ner Chanukah? The Marsha breaks new ground, but you'll be the jury. I'm going to submit to you the following thesis. The Marsha will only answer one out of these 2 questions. It will not suffice for both questions. Let's see if I'm right. Again, I'm not trying to twist your arm. You'll either agree with me or disagree. What was the great breakthrough of the Marsha? Certainly, says Beis Shammai would apply the principle, as always, of Mailim B'Kodesh V'Lo Moridin. However, how does that principle work? Is it an absolute principle, or do we use that principle and apply it whenever it's convenient to do so, but not if we have other factors that press us to undermine Mailim B'Kodesh? So if all things are equal, smooth, glot, we have no issues, Mailim B'Kodesh and Beis Shammai is on board. However, If we have a compelling reason, a time, to suspend the principle of Ma'alim B'Kodesh, then Ma'alim B'Kodesh doesn't apply. We'll see how we prove that in a moment. Therefore, since Beit Shammai were of the opinion that there's a time for Holech v'Poches, therefore the Ma'alim B'Kodesh that universally applies does not apply in this case. Why? Because of the pressing need of Mosiv of Poches v'Holech. To start with 8 and go down. So that trumps the Ma'alim B'Kodesh. And that's the nature of Ma'alim B'Kodesh. Ma'alim B'Kodesh is a rule that when it's convenient and comfortable, we'll apply it. If there's some other reason, then we don't even apply Ma'alim B'Kodesh. Says the Maharsha, you know what Pari HaChag is all about? It's all about Ma'alim B'Kodesh, meaning the suspension of Ma'alim B'Kodesh. What do we see in Pari HaChag? On day 1, we bring, how many is it? I forget now, 14 Purim, and then we go down to 13. I forget the numbers right now. Anyway, this is a violation, so to speak, of Ma'alim B'Kodesh. So when Beit Shammai say, according to the second explanation, that Hoches v'Holech because of Pari HaChag, they don't mean because of Pari HaChag. What's the Shayach Pari HaChag? What's Pari HaChag Shayach? We're talking about Ner Chanuka. Beit Shammai wanted to wave the flag of Pari HaChag as a Gilui Milsa, as a Hochacha B'Alma, what we call a Simon L'Dover, not a Siva L'Dover, that whenever there's room to push Ma'alim B'Kodesh on the side, that's exactly what we have to do. If the Pari HaChag are Keneged Shivim Umos, the 70 nations, then to the extent to which they are adversaries, not Canada, but then we have to be Poches v'Holech. And therefore, we suspend the principle of Ma'alim B'Kodesh. Pari HaChag hayu pochsim v'holchim v'tam yesh b'davar sheshivim parim shal Yisrael makrivim v'sukkos keneged shivim umos ha'olam u'mashe pochsim mehem b'akrovas ha'mikdash l'rameis yishem shepari HaChag holchim v'pochsim kakam umos ha'olam yelchu v'yifchasu. Reminds me of today's Daf Yomi about whether you can use psukim for Zichronos or Rosh Hashanah, Musaf Rosh Hashanah, if it mentions Paradios of the Goyim. If it's Paradios of the Goyim, then it's okay. Because their Paradios is our Simcha. Again, with the exception of Canon. Okay. And now we talk about Ner Chanuka. Ner Chanuka, according to Beit Shammai, Hochsim v'Holchim, there's a reason for that. And therefore, in the light of that reason, Chachamim were kover that we start with 8 candles. And we go down. Not to say or imply that Beit Shammai reject the principle of Ma'alim B'Kodesh, but because of the time of Keneged Pari HaChag, we need Hochsim v'Holchim, and therefore we don't apply the principle of Ma'alim B'Kodesh. But in general, of course, we apply the principle of Ma'alim B'Kodesh. It just seems to me, and again, I'm asking you to be honest with me if you accept this, that the Maharsha is a great breakthrough, but it doesn't really answer the fundamental question of the Pnei Yoshua. Yeah, the Pnei Yoshua was after the Maharsha. Namely, what was Pari HaChag? Again, you're going to tell me that Pari HaChag is just a Simon L'Davar and a demonstration to the fact that we can push aside the principle of Ma'alim B'Kodesh, which the Maharsha insists that Beit Shammai accepted, but why push it aside? Why not go with Beis Hillel, Mosiv v'Holech, Mishum Ma'alim B'Kodesh? So the author of the Hegyonei Halacha, now, he doesn't tell you why he invokes the Beis Yosef here, but I think I understand why, because he's trying to figure out what would be the logical connection here to accept Hochsin v'Holchin and therefore push aside Ma'alim v'Kodesh according to Beit Shammai. What is the Beis Yosef? Chilku Hashem and l'shmona chalokim, b'chol yom hidliku shminis. They knew that it would take 8 days to produce shemen tar. So what they did was they took the volume of shemen that was meant to last for 1 day and they divided up into 1/8 per night. And this is the Pochsim v'Holchim, that magical secret piece of the puzzle as to why Beit Shammai would push aside, if you want to call it override, Ma'alim b'Kodesh. Because again, in the Maharsha's frame of reference, if we have a tam that pushes us, and here the tam is Pochsim v'Holchim. And why is it Pochsim v'Holchim? B'chol yom idliku shminis, shmones hachalokim alolu ho Pochsim v'Holchim mi laila l'laila. Pochsim v'Holchim, meaning you've got on the first night you have 8 times 1/8, right? 8/8. And on the second night, you have 7/8. Third, 6/8, etc., etc. So that's called Pochsim v'Holchim. Again, this is the amazing chiddush of the Beis Yosef. And again, it boggles the mind to think that they would have separated and split the shemen into 8 sections, 8/8, when the Torah requires the full amount. But I guess in this case, Somchen al Nes, I don't know. But once you accept the Beis Yosef, you understand that from the perspective of the volume of shemen, they needed less than that volume on the second night, etc., etc., and they consumed 1/8 incrementally with the increment of each night, and that's called Poches v'Holchim. So if you put together, it's like a cholent, you put the Maharsha and the Beis Yosef together, then you get a picture of Beit Shammai. Why is there no Ma'alim b'Kodesh? Because we want to be Poches v'Holchim. Why do we want to be Poches v'Holchim? Because of the Beis Yosef's explanation, they split it into 8/8. Why did they override Ma'alim b'Kodesh? Because of this reasoning? And the answer is because of Parei Chag. We already saw in Parei Chag that the Umos Ha'olam are Poches v'Holchim, and therefore the Torah pushed aside the principle of Ma'alim b'Kodesh. However, on page 49, he has, how are we doing on the clock? Good. We're doing okay. I just want to, what's, Joe, you have to go?
Well, we're getting close, but remember the Rav's got another week, right? So we can, the Rav doesn't think he doesn't have to squish it all in.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to round it off with this, I don't know what to call it, this statement of the Moshav's Canaan. But by the way, Moshav's Canaan has nothing to do with what you and I associate Moshav's Canaan with. We're talking about Canaan of Chachma, not where we're all going to end up. So anyway, I want to share with you this Moshav's Canaan, and I want to ask you whether it means something to you. Meaning, what I mean to investigate is, again, the Moshav's Canaan were Rishonim, but it sounds on the first level like a Hasidish of Barnes, if you know what I mean. Nothing against Hasidish of Barnes, but So let me ask you, if you if you have access to a chumash by Yikra, just the chumash, not, I don't even need Rashi, just the words of the Torah. We're in Parshas Emor. In Perek Chaf Gimel, at the very end, after the Torah goes through the Moadim, starting with Pesach, which means the last of the Moadim on the list is going to be Sukkot. Ach, b'chamisha soyom, l'chodesh hashvi, etc., etc. Tochogu is Chag Hashem, Shivas Yomim, and this is Chag HaSukkos.
What you said, Perek Chaf Gimel?
Chaf Gimel. The last section in Perek Chaf Gimel.
Which pasuk?
You can start with Pasuk Lamed Tes, and you'll see a whole unit of psukim about Sukkos.
Oh, okay.
You see it?
Hamishi Hasar Yom Lecho.
Right,
okay.
right. And then in Pasuk Mem Daled, by Dav Moshe Me'odei Hashem El Bnei Yisrael, that ends Perek Chaf Gimel, and that really ends the entire cycle of the Moed. In our calendar, there's a Moed, in inverted commas, that comes after Sukkot, which is what? Chanuka. Of course, that's not mentioned in the Torah because Chanuka is the Rabbanah. However, when you open up Perek Chaf Daled, says the Moshe Canaan, what do you see? Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe limor tzavos pnei Yisrael v'yikru elecha shemen zayisov kasis lama'or lahalos ner tamid. You have a unit of 4 psukim that address the mitzvah of ner shebemigdash. Says the Moshe Canaan, this is the source for Beit Shammai. There's the Ma'aseh. What's the connection between Parei Chag and Chanuka? The answer is the Torah places the Menorah immediately following Chag HaSukkos to indicate that there's a connection between the two, between Sukkot and Chanuka. It's not just coincidental that the very next holiday that we celebrate after Sukkot is Chanuka. The Torah went out of its way to tell us, again, it's all b'derech remez, that you will have a holiday of Ner Menorah immediately following Sukkot. I don't know immediately, but anyway, following Sukkot. So the Torah is telling you, according to Beit Shammai, that the connection between these two holidays of Sukkot, followed by the Menorah, representing Chanuka, is that Pochsim V'Holchim. Now, if the Moshe Canaan would have stopped here, I don't know exactly what I would say. I don't want to insult anybody by saying it's a nice bar, but he goes even further. He says that this parsha of 4 psukim at the beginning of Perek Chaf Daled, the mitzvah of Ner Shemenorah, is followed by the mitzvah of Shabbos. Take a look. Pasuk Hey, v'lakachta solos v'afiso so 12 chalos. This is what we call the lechem hapanim, that had to be brought on the shulchan 6 and 6 every single Shabbos. V'nasato al hamareches levona zaka etc. V'isal alechem laskar ish Hashem ches u'biyom haShabbos yarichenu blah blah blah. So now we have 4 psukim of the Menorah that are wedged in between Sukkot at the end of Perek Chaf Gimel and Shabbos, the Lechem Hapanim in this case, that follows immediately after the Shemen Lama'or of the Menorah. Beit Shammai said that we're going to darshan smichus li'el, li'el meaning from Sukkot to Chanuka. Beis Hillel said, no, we're going to darshan smichus milara, meaning from Ner Sheb Menorah to Shabbos. And just like in Shabbos, Again, listen to the logic here. There's halacha of Mosif Holech. What does he mean by that? Tosefes Shabbos. We had a long discussion a few weeks ago about Tosefes Shabbos. Tosefes Shabbos, which means we add. We're Mosif. Says the Moshe Skanim, we have to be Mosif to the Ner from day 1 to day 2. It's almost like the second day is a Tosefes Shabbos, a Tosefes Chanuka for the first day, and the third for the second day, and so forth and so on. I'll tell you the truth, I was absolutely shocked by this. I mean, I don't know. How does this impress you? Just emotionally. There's a certain beauty to it because the Menorah is actually wedged in between Sukkot and Shabbos. But which direction do we apply the smichus? That's going to be machlokas Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai using Parei Chag are going to come up with a principle called Poches V'Holech, like Parei Chag. And that all lies inherent in the connection between Sukkot and Chanukah. Whereas Beit Hillel are going to say, no, Shabbos teaches me Mosif V'Holech, and that's why the Torah added Shabbos right after the Menorah to teach me that Chanukah is Mosif V'Holech. I don't know. It's hard for me to believe that, that this is something that comes out of the Rishonim. If I would tell this over to my Rebbe, I'm afraid he would yell at me. I don't know. All right, so I will say, here's what we got up to.
It's like an asmachta. It's not even like it's
like the Gemara talks about asmachta.
Like
I'm learning now a sugya Yevamis about shnios larayos. So the Gemara derives shnios larayos from psukim. So the Gemara says, if that be the case, then shnios larayos should be doraisa. The Gemara answers asmachta real. That's what I happen to be learning in my Yevamis shir. But again, it's a very fascinating asmachta because, as you and I know, there are halachas that we derive, solid halachas from smichos haparshios. Smichos haparshios is not dvarm shel mavaka. The Torah deliberately puts one parsha after the other and comes on the Moshe Skanim, and the Torah has in mind the very next holiday after Sukkot.
The Menorah that it talks about is not the Menorah of Chanukah, like it's the Menorah of the base of the Mishkan.
Right, but all of Chanukah is about the Menorah and the Mikvah. I mean, if we get a chance, we'll try to discuss it. But I just want to leave you with that thought. In terms of the kasha of the Marsha and the kasha of the Pnei Yeshua, fascinating how we can answer both kashas with weaving in 3 different principles. Very quickly, just to review that. Number 1, we're going to have to assume that Parei Chag establishes that we can push away Milan B'Kodesh whenever we have to do so for something else. Second principle is that in the case of Ner Chanukah, there's something that presses Beit Shammai in favor of Poches V'Holech, and therefore we suspend the rule of Milan B'Kodesh as we did in Parei Chag. And assumption, premise number 3, is that they divided up the Shemen into eighths, and that's called Poches V'Holech. And therefore, Beit Shammai pushed aside Milan B'Kodesh. The Marsha is correct. Beit Shammai never questioned and doubted the principle of Milan B'Kodesh. And the other approach to Beit Shammai is to equate. Now, again, I wanted to make that last point, that according to the Moshe Skanim, Keneged Parei Chag is not a simon l'davar. It's not some sort of external hochacha that we have the right within halacha to suspend Milan B'Kodesh, but rather it's the reason why Beit Shammai hold Poches V'Holech, because of the Parei Chag that a Holech is. Now, what does that have to do with Sukkot, Chanukah and Sukkot? The answer is the Torah put them together. So I thought this was very interesting. I mean, to me, I'll be honest with you. Again, for me, everything we discussed today was kulo chiddush for me, and I've been through a lot of Chanukas. Unfortunately, I was born after my grandfather died. His favorite holiday, I mean, I heard it through all the cousins that are much older than me. I mean, I'm the youngest cousin, and last night I was with the oldest cousin at a Sheva Brothers, and he told me about grandfather. His name was Elchanan Goldenthal. He was a Glitziana Yid. My father's marriage was a mixed marriage. A Litvak with a Glitziana. My mother was from a Glitzianic family. And my grandfather loved Chanuka. That's what they tell me. I was born after. In fact, I have two names. I don't know if you know this. Azariah Elchanan. The Elchanan was my grandfather's name. And there was a whole plugta about whether my father would agree to name me Elchanan, not because he had anything against his shper. Well, okay. But because my name came from already many, many years before when my first brother was Hananya, so he already had Hananya Mishal. I was just waiting to be born as Azariah. But be this as may, my grandfather loved Hanukkah, and he did personally different things to create Hanukkah with his hands. I mean, he had special pouches that he made and he wove with Hanukkah gelt in them. I mean, very special things. He had certain negudim. And we actually have, it's unbelievable, a video, so to speak. It's a record with my grandfather singing in front of all the children that were alive, the grandchildren that were alive at that time. I wasn't alive yet, on a Hanukkah party. It's really interesting. It's so old. In any event, I wasn't so good to be, with my grandfather Hanukkah, but I had many Hanukkahs in my life. And what we learned today, again, I'm only admitting my ignorance. And if not for this sefer, the Hegyonei Halacha, I would remain ignorant. I mean, so many chidushim. I mean, the Rav Avram Lifshitz that we spoke about, the Avbezin of Frankfurt, I mean, that to me is mind-boggling. A whole new puzzle with different pieces that come together to appreciate the Hidur Mitzvah, the concept of Hidur Mitzvah and its centrality in Chanukah. Okay, then, so we'll need to continue 2 weeks from today.
So a quick thing while you're talking about these crazy ideas, just for a second, we have the idea.
I hope you mean Joe crazy in a positive sense. Okay.
Of course.
Yeah, okay.
The Russ talked, I believe, about Purim. We have these connections for Purim to Eretz Yisrael and things of that nature. Is it possible that Beis Shammai wanted to make a connection between, I mean, as strange as it may seem, because the mitzvah itself, the whole thing is in Eretz Yisrael, is the Beis Hamikdash, that he wanted to make this connection to the Beis Hamikdash, that was an intrinsic part of why he wanted to do that people would talk about the Beis Hamikdash when they were talking about Chanuka.
Therefore, he did what?
I would go even further than that, Joe. I would say that the Ner Chanukah itself is Zeichel Mikdash.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's why it's strange. But I'm saying, therefore, he had the Purim. He talks about the Purim, which was an avoda in the Beis Hamikdash. So to connect.
What do you mean by Purim? I lost you on Purim.
Purim.
Oh, Purim. I think said Purim. I'm trying to figure out whether he's joking around because I got your Freilich. What does that have to do with Purim? Purim.
Yeah.
Purim. Purim. Meaning the Mikdash,
the avoda
of Purim. Oh, so that will, again, I think, Joe, what you're saying now would help us in the next section of the Aruch HaShulchan, which is on the bottom of page 49. I mean, the Aruch HaShulchan is the most revolutionary idea of all about Pochs V'Holchan.
Okay.
And that's going to connect Ner Chanukah to, in this case, the Churban Beis Hamikdash. And that's the Pochs and the Holchin, because we lost, when the Yevonim came in, we'll discuss it next time, we lost all the Karbanos of 7 days of Sukkot, and on the 8th day of Shmini Atzeres. That was all outlawed and defeated by the Yevonim. And we're going to celebrate that on Chanukah. And Chanukah, therefore, is a nest that brings us back to the tragedies of the destruction at the hands of the Yevonim of the Karbanos in the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, then. So that's something that we'll try to pick up in 2 weeks' time.
Okay.
And by the way, I just want to thank, I don't remember who it was now because it's already over 10 years. Somebody took me to buy boots in Canadian Tire, I think it's called, on, what's that big street there?
Lawrence?
Lawrence? No, not Lawrence. Canadian Tire.
There's one
Anyway.
in Lawrence.
Okay, anyway, I still remember the boots. And believe it or not, I took these boots to New York and I left them in New York. My wife was just in New York. She asked me if she should bring the boots. So next week, I'm going to be using those boots. Gigantic boots from Canada in the Ukraine. So wish me luck. And the organizer of this trip told me, Rabbi Berzon, you better bring your boots. And I don't have any boots. So my wife had to bring my Canadian boots from before a decade.
What trip is this?
Yeah.
You don't know?
Rav's not going to be here next week.
I won't be here next week. I'm in the Ukraine.
I hear you're not going to be here, but I didn't hear why.
Well, why does anyone go to the Ukraine? To see the anti-Semitic there? Who have murder of Jews in their eyes? I mean, I shouldn't put that on this. I'll get in trouble. But anyway, there's some places still in Ukraine that Jews go to.
Yeah.
You know, my father was 7 generations Lubavitch. 7 generations.
Are you going specifically to a certain place or to certain places?
Oh, yeah. We're going to, I think, 4 different Ukrainian towns, or I don't know what you call them. And we're going to be visiting we're going to be visiting not only the Alter Rebbe, but the Besht. Have you ever been? I think it's called Mezebush or something like that. I can't even pronounce it.
Mezebush.
That's where it is.
So Bosai, if you want me to put in a good word over there, let me know. I mean, this is wild. I mean, I can't believe there's a Talmud of mine who's paying for this. He said, Rabbi Berzon, you have to go. It's an amazing trip. So I'm going to finally use my boots from Canada. All right. Everyone should be well.